Ho, ho, ho!
Good afternoon from the Enchanted Garden. Santa and I have a story. Now, we've told stories based around holidays, but we've decided that we'll also tell stories about events, and today's is such a story. It's called Ogre Incursion, which gives a lot away right off the bat. The sun had just peeked over the redwood and sparkled the faces of some of the flowers in the Enchanted Garden when one of the dragons darted back over the wall and made a beeline for her cave. Unfortunately, Tandy Bucklebottom was camped on her doorstep, tapping her teeny foot in irritation. Unbeknownst to her, the baby dragon had been spotted by an ogre, who immediately began searching for where he saw the baby dragon land. Back in the garden, Incisor was almost bent in half under Tandy's glare. "I can't believe this. There's even a traffic signal at the gates to stop just this sort of thing," she rants. "Just how reckless." "Look at her. Maybe you could take a step back from being the mayor for a minute and be a grandmother, or even a friend," suggested Handy, the dwarf, rather timidly. Tandy's mouth dropped open, then closed again. She stood quite still and then began to speak again. Whoop, I turned 2 pages. Oh, yeah, just give me a break. You don't ever try and read these. Oh. Yeah, you just help me write them. Once more, she stuttered to a stop. Finally, she managed, "Toothless has put this young dragon in my care, so kindly inform me of who you are and why this is any of your concern." "Well, I'm Handy, the dwarf who married Bixie's sister and moved into the redwood, Whopper, recently. I make ladies' hats, remember? And Incisor has been buying quite a few of them from me recently, so we've gotten to know each other. While I don't know what a baby dragon wants with fancy hats, we've become friends." Fergus stepped forward and interrupted. "All well and good, but can I remind you that we have a real problem here? If anything unfriendly spotted Incisor and finds our garden, we're in serious trouble. So can we move on from how to chastise Incisor to what we do about the potential threat?" Marisol, a fairy, fluttered over Fergus and Tandy's heads with alarming news. "This has actually moved from the potential to a real threat because I just flew high enough to spot an ogre who seems to be headed this way." As often happens in the garden, a crowd had gathered, and many began contributing ideas immediately. "Beam him from above. Bribe him with dragon scales." Remember, that's garden money. "Hope he never finds the garden. Move everybody to another location. Dig a huge pit to trap him in." While all this was going on, the giant ogre lumbered up the lane and was outside the yellow gates. "I am Groot!" hollered Groot. This required no translation by anybody. Everyone dove for cover. "This severely limits the debate," whispered Fergus. "Oh, do shut it, Fergus," shot back Tandy. "You are so fetching when riled, Mayor," he responded with a wink. Now what? There was no lock on the gates, so the brute fumbled with the knob for a few tense minutes and swung the gate open. He squeezed his massive body through and was inside. He headed straight for the farmer's market. The owners fled out their back doors and windows and hid themselves in the legs of Gerald, the topiary giraffe. The ogre stopped at sun-drenched fruits. He ran a grimy hand over everything and picked up a crate of cherries and grapes. He shoved the entire thing into his mouth and crunched it up, splintering the wood with squirting red fruit juice running down his beard. He circled the stalls and again paused at Truff Can Bake, the troll's new bakery. He crushed breads and rolls, tossing donuts and cupcakes aside as he settled on a display of luscious cakes. He grabbed the entire tier and rammed them down his maw. He belched and wiped his mouth, his attention caught by the homes in the redwood. He began walking in that direction. Whopper urgently whispered something to Bouncy, another one of the new dwarves, as the ogre neared the giant tree. Suddenly there was a big whump and a large limb thumped down on the ogre's head. He fell flat on the ground and it shook as he was knocked out cold. "Nice bouncing," allowed Whopper. Bouncy grinned and curtsied. "Quick thinking, you two," applauded Fergus. "Root Beer, can you keep him out with fairy dust while we come up with yet another plan?" Root Beer flitted back to her castle quickly for supplies. In short order, she began patrolling around the head of the unconscious ogre, sprinkling fairy dust as needed, and trying not to inhale. The residents of the garden crowded around to get a good look at the monster, and almost immediately began backpedaling. The stench was overpowering. Waves of malodorous gray clouds were drifting off the moldy rags draping the thing's body. Little ones got nauseous, and there were eyes watering and noses running in every direction. One small fairy swooned and had to be carried to a safe remove. "Sweet Zeus, what is that stink?" cried Candy between sneezes. "Let's just call it Essence de Ogre and not investigate any further, Madam Mayor," suggested Kafili, the garden's vet. "It comes under the heading of you don't want to know." "So what do we do with it now?" asked Root Beer. "I can't keep it unconscious indefinitely." "Can't we just drag him out of here and far away?" asked Wendy hopefully. "I am Groot," said Groot. "There's no need to be rude, Groot. He meant well," said Half Pint. "Well, what's wrong with Wendy's idea? Getting that thing a long, long way away seems like a good idea to me," said Laylee, the fairy lifeguard. "Ogres may reek like the village dump and be dumb as a sack of hammers," said Kafili, "but they are keen hunters, and he will remember how to get to the garden, and that he saw a tasty baby dragon and its lair. He will come back. You can bet dragon scales on that." Ambly and Lauren, both elves, had been in a heated side conversation for several minutes while all this was going on. Finally, they finished conferring and turned to address the residents of the garden. "We think we have an idea that will solve at least some of our problem. There is a secret elven spell that causes the being to forget the existence of an object forever. We usually use it to protect our most precious gems. The catch is that we've never tried it on something as big as the Enchanted Garden and all of its inhabitants." "Well, that sounds like just what we need," smiled Tandy. "Finally, some good news." "I should mention another problem with our idea," said Ambly. "It requires a nose hair from the subject to make it work. And given the size of the Enchanted Garden and all of us that we have to make him forget, I would guess that we need all of his nose hair." In unison, everyone turned to look at the ogre's nose with its forest of filthy hairs sticking in every which way out of two gummed up nostrils. It didn't bear thinking about, much less doing. Yet, Kafili added another wrinkle when she informed everyone that the nerves in the nose would be stimulated by the plucking and might override the effects of Root Beer's sedatives, causing the ogre to wake. So Marisol and Laylee were added to the sedative brigade, thereby tripling the amount of fairy dust being delivered to keep him out during the NHEM, nose hair extraction mission. Tandy's naming insistence again. Groot was assigned to stand at the head and make sure that the thing stayed unconscious during the mission. He was given a bell to ring if it looked like the ogre was waking up. That left the filthy job of actually getting the hair. It was decided that Handy, Fergus, and Quarky were the strongest members of the garden, and so they should climb the ogre's clothing and harvest the nose hairs. Excuse me. So a dwarf, a hobbit, and a gnome grimly began the ascent. The clothing was rotten and they kept falling through gaping holes, but they found workarounds and slowly made their way to its chest. They developed a system where Quarky pulled a hair straight and Fergus used an axe to hack it off. Then Handy hauled it over to the side and threw it over. The hairs formed a foul pile down below, while Root Beer, Marisol, and Laylee sprinkled fairy dust liberally to keep the monster asleep. It took all afternoon, but they got the job done. The 6 of them couldn't wait to cleanse the stench off. Emily and Lauren had made a stop at Errol's Elixirs to stock up on some necessary ingredients and were ready to mix the forgetting potion. No one seemed to have a pot big enough to make the brew until Tandy remembered an old bathtub she had way in the back of her hobbit hole. That worked, and the concoction was finished without incident. They used a clever pulley system to get it up to his chest, and then had to climb his rotting clothes once again to sluice it into his mouth with buckets and shovels from Bixie's bees. Everyone was wearing out, but they were still faced with how to move him. For sure, they wanted him outside the garden when he came to, but how to accomplish that hadn't occurred to anyone. Grogu closed his eyes and concentrated very hard. Slowly, the huge form lifted an inch or two from the ground. Everyone cheered. But that was it. Grogu couldn't move him any further, and his strength was waning. So Tandy called for everyone to grab a handful of Ogre and heave. Even Bixie's pet curls pitched in, and slowly the creature was pushed out the gates and down the slope to the far side of the meadow, where Grogu gratefully dropped him in the grass. They all rushed back to the garden and closed the gates. Most everyone hid, but Tandy had a couple of the fairies take up strategic positions where they could see what was happening in the meadow. After a while, the ogre woke and had a big stretch. He got up and looked around, but he showed no interest in the direction of the garden. He began hiking away from the garden and realized that he was taking full deep breaths through his nose. Much easier than before. Nice! And off he went. Back in the garden, everyone stayed hidden for what seemed like a very long time. But that was just because they all stunk from having been in close contact with the ogre. Tandy declared spring cleaning had come to the garden early this year. Sephi the fairy offered discounted prices at her soap stall in the farmer's market for a day because everyone and everything was going to get triple washed and then quadruple washed. While everyone was washing up, Tandy set about baking replacement cakes and pies to help Truff stock his bakery. Fergus's nose led him to her window and he popped in to give her a warm hug. "You are not as prickly as you make out to be, old gal," he said. "Get on with you. You should be helping those dragons wash out their caves. You know they won't do a thorough job without our help," she fussed. He just shook his head chuckling and headed off to help the dragons and to remind them that boundaries were not there just to vex them, but to keep them safe. The end.
Ho, ho, ho! Ho, ho, ho!